And so we're worried. We're going to talk about who we are at CHC. Children's Health Council, we are a community-based nonprofit organization helping teens, children, and then young adults. And come on in, thank you, reach their promise and potential. No, you're okay. Part of our goal is that we want children, teens, and young adults to grow in a lot of different areas. So the circle is learn how to learn, realize their dreams, feel better, have a brighter future, take phone calls. Part of CHC, what our vision is we believe in the promise and potential of every child, teen, and young adult. Our mission is to remove barriers to learning, helping children and teens become resilient, happy, successful at home and at school and in life. And our quest is to strive to remove social, emotional, and learning regardless of language, location, or ability to pay. So I don't have that memorized. I'm sorry, I'm looking and reading. We have 4 main things that we look at. How do we help kids learn, how to learn, looking at physical development. So like our psychiatry team is a big part of that. Academic skills, we have a couple different schools I'll talk about, and mental health and wellness. Our 4 areas of excellence: ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression, and learning differences. So that's kind of the core things that CHC focuses on. And we have different divisions, clinical services. So that's what Sharon and I work in. She works in the clinic with the Medi-Cal families. I work in the center with more of the private pay families. So we do evaluation, therapy, consultations, intensive outpatient program, clinics in Palo Alto, Ravenswood, and South Bay. So we've been growing a lot. We have Esther B. Clark down at the bottom. That's a school. It's a therapeutic day school serving students with emotional behavioral challenges, serving kids from over 40 different school districts. So pretty amazing. And just this year, we started a program for UBC in the South Bay. So that's one of the ways that we've been growing a lot. Community connections, so classes and workshops like what we're doing tonight. EdRev, I'll talk about that in a sec. SAFE is a student-led advocacy program, and so I think it has something to do with the LGBTQ community, and they'll be starting that up more in the fall. Support groups, so we have like a parent support group for ADHD and a parent support group for kids with anxiety that are all free to families. And online resources and volunteer programs and all of that. One of our other schools is Sandhill School. It's an independent day school for kids with learning differences, especially language-based learning differences. Focuses from 1st to 8th grade. And yeah, so at Sandhill, we have Esther B. Clark, so it's pretty awesome having 2 different schools serving kids with different kinds of needs. Here. What we have going on Saturdays, the EdRev Expo. So if you see over here, it's for the 1 and 5 with learning or attention challenges that are often compounded with anxiety and depression. I know for me, I often get families saying, what's what? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? Is it the learning difference? Or is it both? And so oftentimes you have kids who might have attentional challenges who feel anxious because they're getting in trouble in school a lot or in trouble at home a lot. So anyway, this is a really great, huge event that's happening at AT&T Park in San Francisco. It's free for families. If you want to go, you can register for free, and you can go online and check that out. And I think we have flyers in here as well. And then that's our logo for SAFE being a safe place for the LGBTQ community. All right. So now we are on to the agenda, and I was sharing to one of the parents here, if you came to this 2 years ago, it's going to be very similar. It's going to be kind of maybe a refresher from when I presented on this information a couple years ago. But this year, I get to have Sharon and her expertise for treatment. So are we ready to talk about anxiety? So we're going to talk about what it is, what maintains anxiety, and then we're going to talk about how do we help our kids and teens manage their anxiety, and then we'll have some time for questions. So any questions so far? You guys all set? All right. So what is anxiety? Anxiety is an internal sense of worry or dread or fear. Sometimes we know what the triggers are. Sometimes it's not so clear. Kids just feel anxious and not sure why. It can also be a typical response. So all of us experience stress and anxiety. So that's typical. And sometimes you have a little Charlie Brown here. Anxiety. one of the things we like to look at, when is anxiety just kind of your typical response, and when does it become something that's beyond? So it's an excessive level of arousal that causes an unreasonable and disproportionate level of stress in an individual, such as their functioning is impaired or impacted. So that's the big key factor is, do I have anxiety, and does it impact my ability to function in my day-to-day life? One of the things we like to talk about is the figure feedbacks and law. So one of the things I've asked you guys is, what is helpful about stress or anxiety? Staying safe, being careful.
It's a motivator.
It's a motivator. Someone else said something.
Same
Same thing. Yeah. So being safe and careful and motivates you to get the work done that you may feel stressed about. So that's really great. So that's part of where, when you get that kind of stress and anxiety, it actually helps you perform more or better. But if that stress and anxiety gets too high, then your ability to perform goes down. And so sometimes that happens to all of us every now and then, but there's a time where that's kind of the day in, day out, and that then becomes a concern. So there's different kinds of anxiety. We have phobias, panic, obsessions, compulsions. So you think about OCD, social anxiety, and trauma reaction. So those are just a few. Any questions about what those are? So panic, some people think anxiety and panic go hand in hand. They don't necessarily. Panic is more about having these physical responses to whatever the worry or fear is. So, and then people have fear of having panic attacks. And the question about, am I having a heart attack? Something's physically wrong with me. So their anxiety is coming out in these really physical ways.
It's much more acute as well.
Yeah.
So it tends to escalate very, very quickly within 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. All right, common symptoms. So when our kids, they express, or us, we're expressing fears and worries. There can be crying. Sometimes the anxiety comes out with kids who are more irritable. So I know for us, when you're feeling stressed, or when I'm feeling stressed, I can become, my frustration tolerance can go down, and we can be a little bit more edgy and irritable. Oppositional, refusing to do something, and so it looks like defiance, but maybe it's because I'm anxious and I don't want to do it. Sometimes kids are silly and goofy and might look hyper, or they're dysregulated, fidgety, and difficulty concentrating. What does that sound like? ADHD. Is it ADHD or is it anxiety? So that's where people come to us and we try to tease apart what's what. There can be self-doubt, and kids can be fearful and clingy. Oftentimes there's sleep disturbance. I think that's one of the big ones, especially with the teens. When they're feeling really stressed out with work, and then they're not able to sleep, and then that's impacting their ability to function at school. So just how does it kind of build on itself in that way? Repetitive behavior. So sometimes that can be like the OCD behavior. I'm washing my hands repetitively. I'm counting repetitively. Or I have to do these kind of rituals because I feel like that's going to help me. And then panic. So yeah.
Does it affect the memories too?
Does it affect the memories?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean?
So when you have like anxiety disorder, does it affect the memory, like especially when you have like panic or something?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. What do you think?
So there's some research to suggest that anxiety can impact working memory. So if you think about it, if you have many thoughts and worries and you're ruminating, there's less capacity or space to be able to use that frontal lobe processing for other things, like being able to concentrate and focus in school. So there are sometimes that you will see that over that.
That's a good way to understand that question. Thank you. Yeah. And I think that when going back to the concentration piece, where if teachers are giving you reports that they don't seem to be attending, they're zoning out, and yeah, that's going to impact their ability to remember what's being taught or what they're supposed to be doing in school. So thank you. Let's see here.
A lot of times these symptoms just seem be obvious, but they're harder to detect. So they in school they manifest differently. So if you think about expressed fears and worries, sometimes younger kids who are experiencing anxiety, they don't have the verbal capacity to express those things yet. And so being able to assess internal states is much more challenging than external behaviors when somebody's being disruptive in class and not attending. So a lot of times these kids who are suffering with anxiety can kind of fly under the radar.
And I think if that's the other piece where it builds on itself too, is you might have kids who are internalizing it so much because there's a social piece if they don't want others to see it. And so in a way, it's their way of protecting themselves from what others might think about them. So it's that way that anxiety builds on itself that can be hard to pull out and understand what is going on for them. So what happens when kids are anxious? There can be triggers that lead to body reactions. So you think about somatic complaints like stomach aches, headaches, or thoughts. So the negative thinking or negative visualization, I'm kind of thinking about the worst. And that leads to, what does the child do? What are their actions? So am I running away? Am I reacting to everybody around me? So you think about the fight or flight response. So the parasympathetic, we are in our our body's just doing what it needs to do. We're relaxed, it's functioning, breathing, digesting, all that kind of stuff. And when we get that trigger, then that triggers the sympathetic system, which is, oh, you got to take care of yourself. You got to take care of whatever threat is here. And that's the fight or flight response. And so a lot of times you'll have kids, sometimes or oftentimes their action is to avoid and run. So I think that's one of the biggest things, especially with the younger kids, the avoidance piece. I'm going to just avoid this thing that feels threatening and overwhelming to me. And then Sharon's going to talk a little bit about, kind of dig in more into the triggers and the different kinds of ways that we can manage the negative responses. Yes.
I was wondering about your comment about avoidance. Is that like physical avoidance, like physically trying to run away from it, or is it avoiding from dealing with it, or? Like...
Totally, both. Yeah, I think you will have kids who, an example can be, let's say a child is having a hard time in math, and I've worked with kids who have this where, one, they're resistant going to school, and so there's that avoidance of even going to school, or when they're sitting down to do an activity they don't want to do, then there's kind of hiding under the table or leaving the class, or teenagers who might say, I need to go to the bathroom, and they never come back to class. So there's a physical avoidance. And then it's interesting because when you work with kids with anxiety, you can see that wall of like, no, everything's okay. No, I'm fine. And so there's the internal avoidance of like, I'm not even going to go there because it's overwhelming just to even start talking about it. And so, yeah, they're both right. That's how it happens. Yeah. Yes.
I think that sometimes when it looks or appears to be the oppositional behavior, that sometimes teachers don't really recognize that there might be something else going on.
Right.
And so it creates oppositional behavior, so they don't really get the kind of support that they need, or, it's just looked at in a different way, so they don't even get referred for other kinds of resources or get some help.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's hard because if kids have that label of being oppositional, and then they're seen through that kind of more negative lens. And there's there's an author and a psychologist who I really like his work, Ross Green, and he has this phrase that kids will do well if they can, and if they're not, then we need to teach them how to do it. We need to teach them the skills. And so I feel like that mindset is really helpful in terms of, why is the child being oppositional? And I don't imagine that kids want to be bad on purpose. So there's something going on. What can we figure out what's happening? So yeah, that was spot on. Some common physical reactions to feeling anxious: breathing fast, butterflies in the stomach aches, feeling like you need to go to the bathroom, wobbly knees, or that kind of feeling weakness, lightheaded, maybe shaky hands. So those are I think those are the common signs. And then you have kids who might just interpret that as, I feel sick, or something's wrong with me. I don't feel right. And so as parents, you want to figure out, are you sick? I don't know. But when you start seeing the pattern, then that's kind of their body's physical way of saying, I'm not able to deal with something.
How about when the kids complain, my intake is hot?
That is a good question.
No,
I don't know.
Because that's what my kid says. And sometimes I don't know if it's sick or is it just anxious, or
So does he explain it differently in terms of when he's feeling sick to his stomach? Or is it the same description?
Temperature-wise, he said inside he feels hot.
Yeah, it could be a number, is there a certain food that's aggravating his system and kind of creating a reaction in that kind of way? Or is it his way of describing when you're nauseous and your stomach feels it has that, maybe there's a heat to it?
Maybe sometimes he tell me later after he had a blowout, and I felt hot inside. Maybe that might be the sign.
Or it could be anger, also that. Yeah. So I think with kids, and that's the thing too, when kids are feeling upset, their ability to communicate about what's going on goes down. And so that's the kind of the distress or the stress and communication model. So, and I think when you think about ourselves, when I'm feeling frustrated with somebody, my ability to articulate that well to somebody, or with compassion and grace, goes down. So it takes a lot more effort to say, hey, maybe I need a minute before I talk about this. But that's part of understanding what's going on with me physically. Then how do I learn to identify that, to explain that I'm feeling upset, angry, anxious? So what is my body telling me about how I'm feeling? So when you go back to the triggers, when you think about somebody took something I wanted, or I don't have access to something that I want, then I'm having a body reaction. Or I'm having these thoughts like, oh my gosh, I want to hurt them, or I'm so mad, or I want to run away. And then what do? So the goal is, how do you help kids figure this out? Sharon will talk about this more, so that they can communicate that instead of going to the place where they avoid attack, run, whatever it is.
It could be a different kind of a physical reaction then.
It could be, and it's hard because that's where it's as a parent, you're like, well, maybe you really are sick, and so I don't want to, but I think part of that is knowing your kid.
Yeah, how about little or no appetite or picky eating?
Well, yeah, that's picky eating. I think that, to me, that seems, if that's a when they're anxious thing, or if that's what they do all the time. So
It ebbs and flows, but it's kind of there, it's always there somewhat, but ebbs and flows.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes with appetite complaint that comes up, I mean, I think for kids who, it's very difficult because there are so many different physical symptoms, right, that could be categorized as completely something else. But oftentimes you do see these things co-occurring with anxiety, especially for younger kids who, again, cannot verbalize or express. And so there are only so many ways that our body can manifest stress and distress. And one of them is going to be somatic complaints. And I think another thing to keep in mind is the role that the way that oftentimes people think of the mind and body as two separate things, but they're very much connected, and you can definitely see it in anxiety. So and even in lay terms of being able to communicate, you hear people talk about being sick to their stomach or having butterflies before being able to give a presentation or something like that. So it's even within our vernacular. So it's important to keep in mind.
And how do we help kids verbalize that? So I know with anxiety, loss of appetite is common. And so it's hard because how do you help them work through the anxiety, and how do you help them eat? Because that also kind of builds on itself. If you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, then you're not able to handle stress very well. What was that?
I said you're not going to feel good.
Yeah. So, and then what's, again, so, and I'm so sorry, I printed this and I'm realizing that the print is small, so I want to make sure I'm not missing some notes. All right, so the other physical reactions are listed here. With one of the stats, so looking at, this is from 2010, so anxiety disorders, it's looking at how common these anxiety disorders are. And at any point in time, approximately 5% of you have at least one anxiety disorder. So you see social anxiety disorder is one of the highest ones. And then you have specific phobias, generalized anxiety disorder. Panic disorder is a little less common. It's more common for teens and then adults. And one of the things to think about too with the National Institute of Health, so Sharon looked this up, she was great, statistics that an estimated over 31% of US adults experience any anxiety disorder at some time in their lives. So that's really huge to think about with the adult population.
Any clue how these numbers look compared to 20, 30, 50 years ago?
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if that's something that you would. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, we do hear that anxiety or depression are the numbers are rising. So just one other question is, are we able to detect that better? Do we have a more educated culture about mental health? And so is it being identified, what's been there already, is that being identified better nowadays? And then also thinking about how much of that is due to the pressures of our culture. So how much of it is better identification and how much of it is worsening also? A good question. And something else that considers the World Health Organization reports that anxiety disorders are the most common mental disorders worldwide. So that's a kind of a helpful thing to think about. And then, yeah, anxiety disorders affect about 25% of children between ages 13 and 18 years old. It's huge. Probably the most common one. Yes.
Do you have any statistics on younger children, like 4 to 12, 4 to 10?
For children, well, the next slide.
Could you repeat that statistic again that you just mentioned?
Yes. So let me add to that, and then we'll talk about the slide.
The 25%, that one, 25% of children ages 13 to 18.
That's it.
Will have an anxiety disorder diagnosis at some point within that.
Yeah. That's quarter. So it's a lot. And again, what's just kind of your typical anxiety response, and then what turns into something that's more concerning. I'm thinking this one doesn't actually talk about disorders, the percentage of disorders in kids. Did you say 4 years old to 10 years old? Yeah, I don't know that stat. I guess they're. Do you know if that stat? Yeah,
Not at the top of my head.
Yeah.
But, I know that for younger kids, it's still one of the more prevalent, like one of the top mental health disorders or diagnoses that the younger children are experiencing, for sure.
Okay, and I think so this again, it's not about the numbers, but it's showing you what with the younger kids, what they might experience as an anxiety disorder. So separation anxiety disorder is the big one. When you think about dropping off your child at preschool or kindergarten, that's the more common one for your younger age group. Specific phobias. So you see down here, you have the age in years, 0 to 26, and then you have the percentage. So that's where specific phobias and then social anxiety disorder gets higher in the teen years. GAD is generalized anxiety disorder and the panic disorder. So you're seeing kind of what's more common between the age groups. And this, I'm sorry, it's hard to see on your page. This one talks a little bit about what does it look like if it's typical, what does it look like when it becomes an issue, and then what kind of disorder might it be related to. So if you look at toddlers, common to have kids who are shy, that are anxious, unsure about going someplace new, but after some time of going to the school, you'd expect them to start feeling better about it. And then it becomes an issue if there's more panic, if they're refusing to go after a longer period of time, they're clinging, they're crying, they're upset. And it continues. There's not that kind of period of time of getting used to it after a few days or a week or so. So then that becomes more of a concern regarding separation anxiety disorder. So, did you have a question? Yeah.
Well, just when on our handout,
Yeah.
We can't see it, but so I'm wondering what your source was or what your source is for that.
Yeah, this is actually pulled from someone else. So let's see. I'm not exactly sure where that got pulled from. Yeah.
We'll get it later maybe.
It's one of those things where I've been meaning to print it out because I've done this before, and I'm like, I gotta print it out on the one page. So.
Yeah, and one thing that you'll notice with as it walks through these different developmental stages, the way that it maps onto some of the anxiety disorders, it makes sense for the developmental challenges that you think about at each one of those stages, right? So like the toddlerhood and preschool being separation from caregivers, and that's a very big developmental milestone that they're experiencing at that time. And then in moving into elementary school and middle school, obviously with encountering school and working with peers and needing to take tests and being evaluated, and all of that relates to performance-based fears and humiliation and rejection, which is all part of social anxiety. So just framework to think about it developmentally for kids.
Yep. Yeah, I know you summarized it well.
Yeah.
Maybe just
Would children grow out of different things, like they would grow out of separation anxiety, or does it sort of turn into something else? If you have anxiety, after you've gone over the separation anxiety, would it turn into something else, or do these things just kind of disappear?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, and a question that a lot of researchers and everybody is interested to know. So the question being that if there is a child who's diagnosed with separation anxiety disorder, what ends up happening? Does it go away, or does it develop then into a different anxiety disorder? Is that your question? Yeah. Okay. So the answer is that there are many, many different developmental trajectories of these anxiety disorders. So yes, it is entirely possible that after being diagnosed with separation anxiety disorder, that would go away, either with treatment and or without treatment. And it's also possible that it could end up developing later in development into a different type of anxiety disorder. And so researchers have been interested to understand what are the factors that end up contributing to those different developmental trajectories, because you see all of them, multiple, and it's hard to predict.
Is it that's just general anxiety disorder in the end, and it's just kind of being really nitpicky in the beginning, even though you know it's separation?
No, not necessarily. No.
Yeah, so what I was going to say, just to tap onto that, and then I'll answer that part of your question, but I think one of the big factors with the research is the genetic component to anxiety. And so if you think about if a child maybe has this, they're just more sensitive, they're more anxious, maybe there's a genetic history in your family of anxiety, then that could be a predictor of if they have separation anxiety disorder, how does their anxiety manifest, throughout the year. So it's not to say if they have separation anxiety disorder, then they will develop a different kind of anxiety disorder in the future. I think it's just thinking about the genetic load and how that can be a factor into if you have a kid who's just a little bit more anxious than others. And then how do you support them if you kind of understand that about them. But regarding what generalized anxiety disorder is, it's more about just perpetual worry about anything. And I just, I have this fear or dread, I can't put my finger on it. So it's more general in that way, but it doesn't mean that's where everybody goes in the future. It's more about, if I can identify if a child has social anxiety disorder, then they're fitting that criteria better. And even adults or kids can have separation anxiety disorder still. So it's, so that is why you put it in the general, is because it's not like a specific fear or dread of spiders or water or whatever it is. If that makes sense.
My kid he just had a 1 or 2 anxiety about certain things. Now he's getting older and it adds up to the other things. Is it common, or is it?
You're talking about anxiety disorder?
Yeah. So it means that he's getting worse?
Well, I mean, the other question is, are there other factors that contribute to a child's anxiety? So, is there learning difficulties or social difficulties or other kinds of things that make it hard for them to manage just everyday life beyond just anxiety?
Yeah, for example, he have a bathroom phobia. Now he has a phobia for elevator and escalator. Now he has anything natural disaster, whenever happening. So it's adding up now that he's older. So I don't know if something we have to still, do something about it.
Well, I think that's where Sharon can talk about, but yeah, that's the exposure is a big piece, because we'll talk about, I think, about what maintains anxiety, but yeah, is it building on itself? Okay, so if everybody set with this one, I apologize again for the small print. Sure. Thank God for cell phones. So one of the things that people think, our kids might have going on is the catastrophizing. So what if my parents late picking me up? What if they get in a car accident? Or if I go to bed, what if I get kidnapped? So fears of sleeping alone, I need to sleep with mom and dad, or I need to just sit in the chair outside my room while I fall asleep. So there's these ways of kids that are just don't know how to manage these fears and worries, and they're really big, and they feel like it's probably going to happen. So we have the overestimating probability, overestimating the consequences. Even, if your parent gets in a car accident, it might just be a fender bender. So it's just everything's the worst. Or even fortune telling, predicting that something terrible will happen. So these are the kinds of things that feed into our anxiety or kids' anxiety. Avoidance and escape, we've talked about that. and we'll get into what maintains it. Well, what are some of the things that you guys feel maintains anxiety? Yes.
It feels like there's just so much happening from such a young age. They can't really absorb what's happening before some 10 other things are happening.
So you're kind of thinking our culture and what's happening.
Yes,
Yeah.
in this area.
Yeah, so there's like kind of the reality of things in life and Silicon Valley and school pressure.
Overscheduling.
Overscheduling for sure, yeah.
I think whatever interpretation that the child ascribed to an event doesn't get rewired.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't get refreshed or
So they put a meaning onto it and then it kind of sticks there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what that means? I mean, an example on that? Not really clear.
So do you have an example that you would want to give?
So for example, you have two kids who experience seeing a car accident. They're not part of it, see a car accident. And one kid has nightmares, the other kid forgets it, okay? And so first of all, what do they interpret that to be at the time? And then as the years go on, you know, traffic or fast cars or whatever, that first memory of the child who was having nightmares at the beginning they never went back and saying, okay, I was 5 years old, I can understand why I would be scared of that then, but why am I still scared of it now? Now that I have so much evidence to show me that fast cars doesn't mean car accidents.
Yeah, and I was even thinking if doing a presentation and someone laughs and I interpret that as, oh my gosh, I'm sounding stupid. And my interpretation is this really negative interpretation of that. And maybe they just laughed because I said something that they thought I was trying to be funny, you know, but now I'm even more, oh my gosh, what if I'm stupid again in the presentation? So
I think it's a much better example.
No, but thanks for bringing that up because I think that is helpful. So how you interpret the situation is important. Yeah.
Can it be inherited also?
Anxiety?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are genetic factors that lead to, you know, that's where family history is really important. When we work with families, we ask about that. So yeah, I don't know, I can't remember the stats around what the percentage could be. You know, if one parent or both parents have a history of anxiety, but yeah, I don't know. I can't think off the top, but genetic is a component for sure. Yes.
In addition to genetic, if your child is adopted, could it be if you have a really anxious parent and have a really anxious children?
You mean the adopted parent or the biological parents?
Nature. My children are adopted.
Oh,
so I'm saying,
nature,
like, if I'm
nurture.
really anxious and always stressed out,
Sure.
could that influence?
Yeah, so it's the nature nurture question. So what's what?
Yeah, but decades of research have shown both the genetic and environmental influences.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are about something like sleep avoidance or sleep, you know, not wanting to go to sleep or waking up in the middle of the night several times and like you were saying, you know, wanting the mom or the dad. I mean, what would maintain that?
Yes.
That's
Good question. So yeah, sleep, I mean, that's where, that's part of the treatment is how do you help kids and parents work through that? And so one of the things to think about, I guess, as parents, there's reassurance, and then there's kind of the taking over, or you're kind of, if I'm allowing you to sleep in bed with me, or if I let you get up in the middle of the night and get in bed with us, or whatever it is. In a way, it's this message that's saying, you're right, you should be afraid, you should be scared, let me take care of you. And so part of that is how do you help parents break that cycle in a way that the child can manage. So if you're just going to sleep by yourself for the rest of the time, no more getting in bed with us, that's probably not going to work. So that's where working with somebody, figuring out a system, how do you slowly expose them to being able to sleep in bed by themselves. They can, you know, a sleep break ticket, you can only use that one time a night. So there's different strategies for that. So, but yes, it's, as parents, we tend to, it's easier, especially when you're tired and like, if I get up and wake up, then I have a harder time going to sleep too. So those are the challenges. But what's maintaining anxiety? Allowing or encouraging the avoidance. So not encouraging like, yes, you're right, you should stay home from school, but it's just kind of, if this is overwhelming for you to go and ask and order your own food to the server, then in a way I'm taking over and encouraging that behavior to avoid doing that kind of social interaction. Thinking errors, so as we talked about before, kids thinking the worst about things, not having coping skills. So maybe the only thing they really know how to do is to escape, avoid, fight, react. So the coping skills, that's how they're trying to cope with it because they don't have the skills to know how to deal with their anxiety. Excessive reassuring, and then as I was just talking about, taking over. So it prevents the child from developing their own coping skills or experiencing that, oh, that wasn't so bad after all. Or, hey, I made it through the night and I'm fine. And so now I'm teaching myself a new message. Some other things I want to make sure to talk about. So Sharon will talk about this more, but giving the child or the teen the opportunity to start practicing certain things. So whether it's presentations in class, going to school, and interacting with people, it's the new experiences and being able to try those things that's going to hopefully help retrain the brain.
Go through the middle three again.
These
Thinking
three?
errors and just either define it again or an example of that again.
Sure. All right, so thinking errors, start there. So thinking errors are more, that's the catastrophizing, thinking the worst about something, the fortune telling kind of stuff like this bad thing will happen, or misinterpreting an event in a really negative way, so negative thought patterns. The lack of coping skills. So if I'm feeling anxious, my stomach's hurting, I have headaches, all I really know how to do is bundle up in bed and go to sleep. And so, yes, you're coping with the anxiety, but you're not actually working through it. So if all you do is avoid, then you never have the chance to work through it. So the coping skills is really about, again, that's going to be Sharon's thing that she'll talk more about, but developing, deep breathing strategies, taking a break and then facing the fear, challenging yourself, detective work, things like that. So the coping skills is how do I actually work through the anxiety as opposed to only avoid it. Excessive reassuring is as parents, you're going to be okay, you're going to be fine, nothing's really wrong. So there's, in a sense, joining, because as parents, obviously, you want to comfort your child, and you want to help them feel better. But again, as I was saying before, sometimes that gives this, not underhanded, but it gives a message that, gosh, you're right, like you should feel this kind of stressed out. So how do you validate your kids and say, I hear you, I hear that you're feeling stressed, I hear that you're feeling overwhelmed. Let's figure out a way, how can we work through this together? So that there's the reassuring, but there's the how do I help us take the steps towards facing the issue that's happening, so that we can actually overcome that.
So what you mean is to be more specific about what to assure them?
It's so it's more about validating and kind of reassuring, I hear what's going on for you, but it's not, you're not joining them in it, but it's validation and how to help, move towards problem solving. And so there's taking care of, it's almost like you're shielding your kid from the thing that's stressing them out. So you're right, this thing is so scary, let me help you away from it. Even though that's not really maybe what you're thinking, but that's kind of what can happen. Yeah.
So I think generally anxiety inducing is a lack of a sense of control.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of what kids are going through in middle school or high school and how much they're not in control, right? So to me, that's a big, right? And then giving them a sense of what they can control.
Yes.
Do you think that's coupled with the element of threat? Is if there's no threat, then control, who cares? But if there's a threat, then
Well, I mean, certainly a threat's gonna,
any perceived threat. I'm not going to do well on stage. I'm not going to do well on a test.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't have control over it.
Right.
Well, yeah, and there's the reality that that what's going on in our culture is really overwhelming. We have the lockdown drills at schools, and there's some legitimate stuff that I think when we were those ages, we didn't have to deal with the same kinds of things that our kids are dealing with. And so I think that's legitimate. And so part of that is what's perceived threat, what's an actual threat, and how do we make it through with providing the structure. I think you named it in terms of what can we give kids a sense of control of, and so that's part of overscheduled kids. They're like everything just feels overwhelming, and so how do we give them structure, predictability in their day, to help them feel grounded, and then also downtime to just kind of let down. There's not this I have to perform for this, I have to perform for that, and then I have to perform for this. And so I think that just feels overwhelming because you're always on and heat up. And then you never have time to let down until you go to bed, and then you can't let down in bed because then you have all this other stuff. I feel like I rambled on that. Any other questions about this one? Something I think about with the anxiety, so the excessive reassuring, I sometimes think about it as, so one of the things that you can think with anxiety, sometimes you externalize it. So it feels like a big wave that's coming through, or a little orange kitten that you turn into a huge lion. And so if you're reassuring, it's kind of saying, hey, yeah, that thing is really big, that thing is really scary, as opposed to how do I help the kind of reinterpreting what's going on for you, but what can we do about this thing so it's not this big overwhelming, I can't do anything about it. Or even knowing, yeah, right now you're feeling this overwhelmed, but in a little bit you're going to feel that anxiety's not going to feel, the wave's not going to feel as huge. All right. There's also, I want to make sure to give Sharon time. So we have common thinking, or outcomes of avoidance. This is not, there we go. All right, so if the child enters a difficult situation and they become anxious and fearful, then they avoid the situation or ask another person to do it for them. And then on the short term, it relieves their anxiety. But in the long term, they continue to have this kind of negative thought pattern about that, like this thing is going to be bad. So they never have the chance to challenge themselves to work through it. So then it can look like this. The child enters the first situation, then they avoid it. Then they feel like anxious again, and then they avoid it because the only thing they know how to do is avoid it. So it stays high. That issue, whatever it is that they're afraid of, or going to bed, or just this general sense of worry, it continues to stay up there. So what the hope is, if the child enters the feared situation and they endure the situation, then the distress ends up decreasing, but it's going to take time. So it's hard to convince kids to try something or to expose themselves to something because they have to endure that really uncomfortable feeling for a while. And you had a great point about just enduring distress and how what research says about that.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to remember what it was.
Oh, do you not? Okay. I think what we were saying, we talked about coping skills.
Yeah.
And I'm distracted by that because I don't know what I just did. But we think about, you have to teach kids coping skills in order to manage an anxious situation. But what you were saying, research is showing that even if kids just learn to endure an anxious situation, it actually helps their anxiety reduce.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
The exposure itself and just going through the motions of that. And I think one other point too is being able to go through this part of essentially learning a new habit and learning a new behavior is essentially what this process is. And one of because all of my research has to do with self-regulation, that's also the lens that I have in doing this. And the areas of the brain that contribute most to our self-regulation skills is this part right here, the frontal lobe, and that continues to develop well into the age of 25. And the two critical periods of development of these areas are, one is in preschool and another one is in adolescence. And those areas are really crucial to being able to develop some of these coping skills to then relearn this habit. But the good news about that is that because it's still developing, it means that we can work on it. It's susceptible to change.
Yeah. So about the endurance, I mean, but how far you can go? I mean, you cannot force them to go up to the point that you have fit, right?
So that's where, yeah, I think working on developing strategies, if you feel like you're not sure if you have the tools to do that, that's potentially where working with a therapist to identify how much do you expose them to the situation. So an example could be if I have a fear of snakes, then maybe what I'm going to do first is watch a video about snakes. And then I'm going to think about how stressed out I feel about that, and I'm going to watch that video for 10 minutes. So there can be, let's do it step by step, because you're right, you don't want to, on the flip side, overexpose a person where they're like, you're right, that situation was awful, and now I feel even like my fear of that thing was confirmed.
Yeah.
So there's that caveat.
So like
Sorry, it's okay. Let me go into him.
Yeah. So if there is a root cause that stays, so for example, say bullying in school or something like that, and there's anxiety because of that, does exposure alone actually still provide benefit in coping, even if that root cause?
Yeah, that's a
is still there?
good point. It's not that, yeah, it's not a catch-all. I think with what we're talking about isn't a catch-all for everything with anxiety.
So would you say that it's more effective if the cause is sort of the unknown as opposed to the known?
It's more effective for like OCD type things or phobias. So the exposure to stress or it's something that's non-threatening. I mean, that's where bullying or other things, like there's a threat to that that can feel overwhelming. So the other piece is trauma. It's not like get exposed to trauma all the time. So I mean, that would turn what we're saying on its head if you say you should go serve in the military and you're traumatized, but the more you get exposed to traumatic events, you'll be fine. Like, no, that doesn't work. So you're right. Like we want to be careful with what we're saying. I think it's more related to if I have a fear of doing presentations, then when I'm doing a presentation and I'm like I have this anxiety that's overwhelming, and then when I'm done, I can realize I survived it and I'm okay. Maybe it wasn't awesome, but I worked through that. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah.
Okay. Did anyone else?
Just a quick question on use of neurolinguistic programming or pre-K dissociation. Any of those?
I didn't hear the first part.
Neurolinguistic programming. Anything there?
It's not anything I'm familiar with.
For anxiety, neurolinguistic.
Fast phobia cures, PTSD, anxieties.
This is a specific treatment option you're talking
Well,
about?
NLP is sort of a big philosophy, I
Okay.
guess, for practice. But there's like, in an hour, you can get rid of PTSD.
Interesting.
Yes. In a word.
Yeah. It's hard because what you want to figure out is what kinds of interventions are evidence-based and research supported. Or you're going to have a bunch of snake oil promises out there. And part of it is maybe there's something that's out there that's really promising, but you want there to be the research and the clinical trials to say, yes, this thing is legitimate.
Right.
So, yeah.
Can I
But
suggest,
neurolinguistic-
maybe this has to do with the irrational fears, right? So if it's an irrational fear, the desensitization process can beat it. But if it's a fear of something that's really damaging,
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying what we were trying to say. That's well said, absolutely. Because you're right, if the irrational fear, if you can say exposure to that and experiencing that and realizing it's not as bad as it should have been versus this threat is an actual threat and it is as bad as it should be. So thank you. That's a really helpful way to clarify that.
Except the only thing I could think of is it's all in the perception of the child.
It's how they're thinking about it.
So to say that it's irrational, you have to be really careful because it really is their perception of how they're perceiving.
So
what it is.
yeah, so that's the thing is the thing actually a threat, or is it the way your child is thinking that is making it a threat? So then that, again, you don't want to dismiss it and minimize me like it's too big of a deal. Like how do you get the validation but not join? So I'll do one or two couple quick questions. I want Sharon to have some time to do what to do about anxiety. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Do you want me to click from here?
Oh,
You got it.
sure. Okay.
Thank you guys for your great questions, by the way.
So I guess there are a lot of different coping strategies and different I guess ports of entry you could say in terms of where to intervene. So that diagram that we saw before that we were looking at with the trigger, and then you have a body reaction and thoughts that are either visual or verbal, and then you have the action, the behavior. So for some children, it might be more effective to target the body reaction, right? And to teach coping skills that are more related to relaxation. For other kids, it might be more effective to target irrational fears, right? And talking about, oh wait, like this is how you're looking at it and perceiving it, but it's actually this way. But for other kids, those cognitive thoughts are not helpful at all because they're still they can even vocalize to you, I know that this fear doesn't make any sense, but I have this physical reaction of anxiety and I'm scared of it. And so those are some things to think about. Some general places to start. So we've talked quite a bit about sleep and ensuring that you're exercising, having healthy food, things that you would, seem pretty obvious. And Also, we talked about this as well, learning how to just have some time to be a kid and not be so overscheduled and stressed in that sense. And
I was thinking, something with being overbooked, when like the adrenaline or your cortisol goes higher. And so I think that's part, like we talk about, I remember being in a class where someone talked about there's an addiction to that. Like it's when I don't know if you remember when you're done with a big project or you're done at school. And if you have your finals week, and then after finals week, a lot of people experience depression. It's because they've just been on this high energy cortisol, adrenaline kind of kick for so long, and your body's actually saying, yeah, I can relax, but it has this depressive kind of feeling. So that's part of our overbooked kids is their cortisol is just kicking high all the time, and it's hard for the brains to shut down and just be still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. In this strategy here, so one of the reasons why we're shifting a little bit to the strategy for parents is because oftentimes for children, they are looking to their parents as their primary role models for how to self-regulate. So it gives parents a little bit of time to think for themselves about how they're regulating in front of their children, managing their own worries and anxiety and emotions and things like that. And so this is just a strategy with the actually acronym of CALM, of remembering that in these moments, to first catch your breath, take a moment. If it requires, look, I need to take a step back from the situation, verbalizing that to your child, saying that you need a moment. Accepting any negative feelings. So perhaps in the moment with the child, of listening to what it is that they're experiencing, and helping give words to the emotions that they might be experiencing. So parents, you guys know your kids very, very well, to a point where you know exactly that moment when they're about to tip and go into either a temper tantrum and outburst, or tip into a moment of where they cannot manage their anxiety. And so even being able to label those things in terms of what you are physically observing in them. Oh, I'm starting to notice that your fists are getting very tight, or your body's, whatever it is that is indicating to you that this is beginning to occur for them, starting to become very mindful and aware yourself. And then as you verbalize and label that for your child, they will also begin to internalize that as well. And then the last one, M, modeling coping skills. So showing your child how you're able to regulate your own emotions. So taking a break yourself, or even if there's those moments where you cannot regulate yourself, acknowledging that and owning that and saying that, you know what, there are times that mommy and daddy can have a really hard time with emotions and feelings, and this is what happened, and this is what we could do instead in the future. Oh, let's practice it right now when we're not feeling so hot in our feelings. Okay, so and we'll get into more detail about very specific coping skills, but overall, when we talk about coping skills, we talk about things that are going to help us calm down physically, being able to talk through a situation, problem solving, and being able to be a little bit more flexible. Oftentimes anxiety will occur during things that are unplanned or unexpected, so being able to come up with the plan B, C, D, E, F. And then being able to challenge some of those anxious or negative thoughts.
What do you mean challenging?
So challenging it could be like, so some of those catastrophizing thoughts that we thought of before, or like the fortune telling, or like, oh, I know that when I get in front of that classroom and I give my presentation, the teacher is going to hate it, or all the kids are going to laugh at me. Oh, how do you know that? Has it happened before? Like, how do you know that it's going to happen if it hasn't happened yet? It's kind of walking through scenarios like that. So for the first one, the ability to calm down physically, some of the body relaxation strategies, some of which I think schools are beginning to incorporate some more of this. So I'm sure kids at this point have gotten exposure to some form of deep breathing. The challenge with this is that oftentimes children may not be engaging in it correctly. And so all they, in the moment they're experiencing this panic or this anxiety, and they're like, oh, just that, you're telling me to breathe? Like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so there's not very much buy-in. But if instructed correctly, there is a proper way to do deep breathing. So people who have experience either with singing or with playing woodwind instruments are very good at this. It's called diaphragmatic breathing. And the reason why breathing from your diaphragm is important is because it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we had talked about before. So there is very much a physiological response of being able to, you had mentioned what are the things that children do have control over. And this is one of the things and one of the skills that if kids are able to learn this, it's very, very powerful because they learn that they do have the ability to control some of the physical symptoms of anxiety that they're experiencing. And so the way that you do, oftentimes it sounds like an ocean breath or being able to expand your belly and push it out, like a Santa belly. There are a lot of different developmentally appropriate analogies of teaching this skill. And so one example, I worked with a young adult who had continued to tell me, stop telling me to breathe. I've had so many therapists I've gone to, breathing doesn't work for me. And for her anxiety would at times manifest as hiccups. She would get hiccups and had to have trouble breathing. And so she had experienced this during one of our sessions together. And so I ended up walking her through diaphragmatic breathing. So if when you hiccup, your diaphragm is spasming. And so I walked her through trying to breathe properly, and she did it, and her hiccups subsided within a minute. And after that experience, I never heard again a complaint about doing breathing exercises with me. So there is this buy-in component that ends up being quite important for kids. And so there are some helpful apps as well called, you can look it up, like different biofeedback apps that are sometimes useful and the reason why it's called biofeedback is because your body is giving you feedback on how you're doing. So there are various different tools of regulating your heart rate, your breathing rate, stuff like that. And kids can see the way that if they are engaging in this deep breathing skill properly, that they can regulate their heart rate. And it can be very powerful. And other ways, such as visualizing special places, safe places, different memories, things that are soothing to them, and that's where you can really build on what things might interest them. So every kid has, some sort of special place or rewarding place for them that they can think of.
Something I wanted to counter the deep breathing. Oftentimes when we're feeling anxious, we're doing shallow breathing in our chest. And so that's part of where, like, when you do that, you feel that tension in your chest. And so that's part of the educational piece of for us to do that deep breathing, so we're actually engaging our body and having that physiological response. And then you're going to have kids who are like, deep breathing doesn't work. So it's how you practice it. Let's keep practicing it. When do you use it? So did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I really like the deep breathing technique as well. And I find that with younger children, if you're like eye to eye with them and you're at their level and you have them breathe with you, that means they're watching you, and it's really very effective. They really immediately take on that slower breathing.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really nice for the younger children to see the eye to eye with them.
You're modeling it.
Yeah, and modeling it is great. And for younger children, there are a lot of really good analogies, like using bubbles and being able to blow the bubble just so that it doesn't pop and it just becomes bigger. For older kids, we do candles, so actually taking out a candle and lighting it and blowing it just so it flickers, but not so that it goes out. And it's nice because it gives them something to focus on as well. Other things for younger kids that I've done is breathing in and then breathing out like a snake. So it's really in the exhale that you get that benefit with relaxation. Oh, yeah, so here we go. There's some sniffing a flower or something that your child really likes.
And then the other piece of how to teach them to breathe in their nose slowly and then blow out of their mouth slowly. So that's kind of how do you get visualize, sometimes it's smell the birthday cake, blow out the candles, whatever fun idea that helps them remember, breathe in your nose, breathe out of your mouth.
And another one is progressive muscle relaxation. And so the point behind this is that you are able to feel how tense it is that your muscles are and really feel what it feels like for your body to be completely relaxed. And so again, there are some different developmentally appropriate kind of analogies that you can use of being a tin soldier, being very firm and straight, and then a loose rubber band or a rag doll. You can also individualize this to be all of these things. You can be quite creative with depending on what your child is interested in. So with other examples like Minecraft characters who are very stiff and box-like and firm, and then doing it for every single body part. So starting from the top of your head to your face, scrunching up your face like with this and letting go, making your jaw slack. So really going through every single component can be helpful. And then, so for some of the targeting the thoughts, being able to verbalize and identify what the worry might be, and taking a look at that thought. And sometimes it can be helpful, like Emily had mentioned, of thinking of it in this kind of detective sort of way of, can I sit on this observation deck, lay out my thought and my worry, and really examine it and see whether or not it's true. And also evaluating, well, like what would the worst thing be if this were to occur, if my worst fear were to happen? And how probable is it that this is going to happen?
Is this after kid had a panic attack, right? Not at the moment.
No, I think these are the things you do and when kids are calm and neutral. I think again, when you think of the stress model, if your stress is high, then your ability to reason is going to go low. Your ability to hear and communicate is going to be low.
So wait until after.
Yeah. So in those moments, it would be more effective to do some of the relaxation strategies, but and to call upon those if it's something that the child has already been practicing, right?
Is it distraction be okay?
Distraction. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it went at the moment.
So at times active distraction can be helpful, and then you kind of come to the issue of, okay, well, in those moments then is active distraction then a way of avoiding the situation? So it's a fine balance. Did you have
No, similar.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the word choice of bad,
Oh gosh.
right?
Oh,
So,
it's the bad
I mean,
thing.
it's like this thing that you don't like
Yeah.
versus bad, good.
Mm-hmm.
What's something that could be legitimately bad?
That's when you get into your Charlie Brown thing, being anxious about your anxieties.
Mhm.
Being anxious is not a bad thing, it's a message.
Yeah. Well, it's something you need to take care of. Yeah, so yeah, that's true. I mean, the language we use is also how do we label things and how does that feed into the anxiety or how does it kind of help you think about it differently?
Yeah, so and to that point, if you wanted, you could just kind of stick to the facts, like instead of labeling it with bad, whatever, the fear consequence might be.
But no, that's a good point. I mean, that's something to think of how do I word these slides? So how likely is it that this thing that you're afraid of will happen? Could be a different way to frame it. You're not saying you're right, the thing is that. So,
I was kind of thinking the same way that word was a childlike word that maybe someone chose for that. But my granddaughter had a fear of a tree in her backyard falling, and it was dying a little bit. It was a tall, like a pine or sequoia or something, I don't know, but the top of it was dying, and she just was so terrified she couldn't sleep and all this. So we went through something like that where I said, well, maybe it will
fall down. Do you think it's long enough that we'll come over to the house? I said, I don't think so. And she said, well, I don't know, but maybe you could come. And I said, and then what would we do? What would happen? Oh, it would fall on the roof. Okay, and the roof would be broken. Then what will we do? We would get the roof fixed. And we just went through.
So some problem
until
solving.
the mad thing diminished and it was going to be, we were capable of dealing with it in little bits.
Right.
We didn't even care about whether it was going to fall down.
Yeah.
We were prepared. But anyway, that's just my.
That's protective work.
So again, talking about this example of thoughts matter. So what if she's been in a car accident? And the competing thought being, I bet she got stuck in traffic, that a child's interpretation of these thoughts and the emotions that they're going to feel at the consequence of these thoughts is going to be different. And being able to kind of visualize in terms of like more of the visual theory, and if your child is more of a visual person, being able to engage in things such as more guided imagery or coming up with scenes that are more pleasing can be helpful in kind of reducing fear around these thoughts. And also, I mean, with guided imagery, you can build in language about how awesome it is that your child is able to engage in these relaxation skills for themselves, engage in deep breathing skills to calm their bodies, and that they're really the boss of that, and they do have control over that. And using that sort of empowering language can be really helpful for some of these kids. And then kind of related to the exposure piece of slowly and gradually taking steps to face some of these fears. When therapeutically, we talk about creating a fear hierarchy or a fear ladder of slowly taking these steps. And then building this arsenal of different coping tools in their toolbox, that there may be some that are more helpful in certain situations, but after they build this, all of these different coping skills, that they can grab and pick and choose which ones are most effective for them. And then also praising your child for the effort of attempting to face some of these fears. So not necessarily praising whether or not they're successful, so to speak, or whether or not there's a significant reduction in anxiety, but just praising the effort itself is more important. And so again, just kind of this graph showing that over time, as the child continues to enter the situation and learn from the opportunity of seeing like, oh, I was able to do this thing, or oh, I did this thing, I still had anxiety, oh, I was able to engage in this activity despite having anxiety. So it's like how also helping teach children, how do I go on with my life despite having anxiety, right? Yeah.
This takes a lot of time and patience, and I just wonder, because I face this all the time with my son.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, sometimes it's just time to give up, and I do, but you know, how do you decide when is a good time to give up?
Mm-hmm.
Usually it's when I just can't handle it anymore personally, but like, you know, just helping somebody enter a new situation. You know, sometimes it becomes so stressful that even I can't take it, and that's when I stop. But I mean, it's good to keep exposing and keep going through the process. So what would you suggest for, like, I don't know, just patience is a virtue, I know, but then like, when is enough?
Yeah. It's a good question. It does, you're right. This does take a lot of effort. And I think as parents begin to appreciate how much effort it takes, I think they begin to also become quite empathetic for their children. That this is something that they deal with potentially on a constant basis, and it's requiring a lot of effort on their part, both physically and emotionally, but then also mentally, so they have less space and capacity for other things as well. And so your question of at what point do I stop, do you mean like give up in terms of like exposing them to the fear?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, I don't want to be too overly accommodating. There's a
Right.
balance, right?
Right. Well, and I think that that's something where you begin to ask how much is this fear interfering, or like how much is the avoidance behavior interfering with my child's functioning and ability to so is it like school avoidance and accommodating just not going to school? Like that doesn't seem like
No, it's not
it'd be an option. But so
I know it's tricky because I think, I think that's where, what is it that you're exposing? Like if the child doesn't want to play soccer because they're not good at it, and you're like, if I keep exposing you to playing soccer, then you're going to feel bad. So there's kind of what's the thing that they're avoiding, and how much is it impacting their ability to function in life? Are they going to function in life not playing soccer? Yes. Are they going to function in life not going to school? No. So I think that's part of where, what do you give up on, and what do you maybe figure out how to challenge, and seeing is there help that maybe you can get to help work through what's going to keep them from functioning in life.
Yeah, that question to me was sort of like a little bit of a takeoff of, at what point do you really need to get some other help?
Yeah.
At what point do you really say, I this just isn't working, and if it is, how long can you do it so that you're not just begin to get frustrated rather than empathetic? So at what point do you say then, I need help, and I go for outside counseling, so for maybe him or the both of us, or some new ideas on how to do this?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's where one of the things that CHC does offer, and we'll talk about this a little bit, what we do offer, but one of the things is 30-minute consults that are free to the community. So you can call our main line and see if that's something you want to do. If you're at a point where you're saying, I'm not sure what I'm doing or what I'm doing as a parent is enough, what kind of help could be available, and when do I kind of seek that?
It seems like it could also be like something else might be involved. I mean, you don't really know. I mean, maybe it's not just anxiety, or maybe it's something other than anxiety. And as a parent, we're so in the middle of it, deep in it, that you need, like you said, help to determine this.
I'm guessing in cases, it's not actually the thing that they're afraid of. Anxiety is keeping them safe. Anxiety itself is keeping them safe.
Mm-hmm.
So why would I give that up if I think it's keeping me safe?
Or it's one thing I have control of.
Mhm.
So yeah.
So, sorry for talking so much, but kind
I
of,
appreciate your guys' engagement.
we kind of been through the wards, and we've been to that place where you're just up against the wall, right? And I don't know what to do and all that kind of stuff. So, you really do need to build a team of people. And sometimes it's fear of your child. If you can get the right kid involved, but you get overwhelmed. You got to get other people in it. And there are some great resources. So like it was a Parents Network. I forgot what, the
Parents Helping Parents.
Well, Parents Helping Parents, and also the EdRev thing was a it can be great, right? And now and then you can go to these things that'll cost you $20. There'll be a therapist and 5 other parents in there, and you'll be sharing all this other information. You get this feeling you're not so alone,
Right.
And you get other ideas. So I encourage people to look at that stuff.
Yeah, there is. So the PEN, so the Parent Education Network.
But actually CHC
Is because CHC is you're right. There's other flyers and things over on the table afterwards you can check out. But there's also there's a parent-led ADHD and anxiety groups that are free to the community, and so the anxiety group meets somewhere else. I forget where it is. The ADHD group meets here, but that's something else. Seeing what's in the community. And that's sometimes you as parents, as you're saying, you guys are sometimes the best teachers and supports for one another, because you guys have been in it and can share, here's what we've done, here's what worked. And that village piece is so important in terms of for your own sanity and also for your kids. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm gonna let you take it, sorry.
What?
I'm gonna let you can.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say that I feel like with my daughter, that I became part of the trigger.
So when we kept on going over and over and over and over and doing the exposure, part of her anxiety was connected to the fact that it was me asking her to do the exposure. So having a therapist get involved and be the one requesting the exposure took me as the trigger out of it and was so supportive because it was someone else asking her to do the exposure, not me always being the one. And I got tied up into the whole feeling, which was tough for her.
Yeah.
And once we got that, I became disconnected from the exposure behavior. She actually did it.
Right.
Because I wasn't the one anymore.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents, but it was really super helpful. And we realized that I was part of it. You know, I enabled the behavior over and over again. So.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, has in your experience, has kids ever used symptoms of anxiety to manipulate parents?
No.
Because a lot of times you can identify things as you know, a disorder, and it's really them maybe finding that sort of pattern of acting out as anxiety, or maybe they actually have anxiety, but they buttress it as a way of manipulating you to get what they want. Meaning they'll suddenly go into an anxiety symptom state, but really it's something they've sort of maybe picked up as a pattern, like, hey, I did that once and it worked. Or like maybe a lawyer who convinces himself that this person did something right when they were wrong, and then they believe the lie. Kind of like the same thing, like they adapt that because they have it as a sleeper cell, but then they sort of use it to manipulate.
So, I mean, it's entirely possible that, you know, I've heard of, especially like somatic complaints and trying to avoid school, right? That's a really common one. And the most important piece with that is being able to understand, okay, well, whether or not it's you want to interpret it as manipulation, the fact that the behavior and the act is happening, there's something that is maintaining it. And so being able to functionally look at that behavior and what is the piece that's maintaining it and addressing that ends up being the core piece of treatment. There are other cases too where perhaps the somatic complaints initially there's some sort of there's a reward that's associated with it, right? Like being able to stay at home, play games, hang out with mom, whatever it might be. And the child is not cognizant of the fact that that habit is occurring, not completely like conscious, so to speak, that that's occurring, and that at times, because I worked in a pediatric pain clinic for a while, and so this was a common presenting concern where there are children who were presenting with chronic pain conditions that had gone through the rigmarole of all sort of physicians coming back saying, look, there's not a medical etiology of your pain, but how invalidating that was for the child to hear that, right? Because they're coming in saying, I experience pain. And so the approach to that psychologically is, yes, okay, we acknowledge that you are experiencing the pain. And it's very possible that, yes, they are experiencing that pain. And that it's maintained by this behavioral pattern. And it was more focused, our treatment was more focused on, okay, how do we break that pattern? Because that's a problem. So despite having pain, how do you go to school? And how do you
Yeah, because oftentimes I feel like my son has anxiety, but then sometimes maybe taps into that same anxiety to maybe manipulate the situation sometimes.
That could be coping mechanism.
Yeah, that very well.
Do I take one more focus? We do, I mean, we have like 5 more minutes and or something. So I don't know if you, I know you've been raising your hand.
Yeah,
for a while.
I have a question for social anxiety. So the problem is you are afraid of people because you're afraid of what they think. Then it's hard because you can't go to therapy because that's people again. You can go to a group because that's people again. And if you endure and you go through this fear of going to a social event, but the social event, of course, is not anything that's rewarding because it's actually terrible because you're scared all the time. You will just do this a few times and then you will stop doing it and then you can repeat it. So is there any idea you have to get help, or it's probably best to see somebody, but how do you get the trust for this child to really open up and talk to somebody?
Yeah, that's hard because you're right, that's exposing them to another person. So I think that's part of how does your child build rapport and the clinician being really aware of the level of social anxiety so that they can build that rapport and create a safe space for them, not force them to talk about things they're uncomfortable talking about, but how to, again, helping them feel comfortable in just that process and being able to review that together. How was your time hanging out with me today? How are you feeling about it? And letting their feeling, it's okay for them to have feeling that's awful, I don't like it. I'm hoping tomorrow or next time will be better. So I don't know if you have a thought on that.
There is some experimenting going on about virtual reality and doing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Put a person very safely in a non-existent people. Maybe that will come up soon for a child. I don't know. But I'm hoping for it.
Should I just quickly run through the?
I think so. Is that okay? I know you guys will have great. Yeah.
So these are things that we've talked about. So starting slow. Yeah, so I mean, I think going back to the power of parents and you guys and how important your role is, I think that cannot be stressed enough. So some of the research I was done in my clinic was on how one of the most predictive factors of positive treatment outcomes for children who are anxious was actually tracking parenting symptoms and parent stress. And it was actually reduction in parenting stress that was the most predictive of better outcomes for their kids. So just something to keep in mind. And some general school strategies for being able to, if pursuing an IEP or 504 plan and accommodations at school is a route that you're going, that there are times that these sort of accommodations can be incorporated into those plans. So communicating with the school and communicating with teachers, identifying any accommodations that might be helpful related to, say, like test taking. There's a lot of work in schools done around the concept of growth mindset. So this idea that failures and mistakes are big wins because that's the only way that you learn. So it's a really helpful resource to look into. Carol Dweck is the researcher and author associated with that. So again, some test taking strategies, alternating the type of test format is something that schools will sometimes do in these sort of 504 plans or IEP plans. Various stressful experiences. I'm not sure how.
Yeah, that's not a strategy.
Okay. We had briefly talked about this as well. When is the time to seek some additional help? So at a point where you feel like the problems are becoming so severe that they really are impacting functioning in a way that you feel like it would be helpful to get some additional resources and accessing some of the things that are free. So these like consult services that are offered at the clinic. I know at EdRev as well that they're going to have some psych consult slots as well.
The Ed Revolution you can read about it. It's on Saturday at AT&T Park.
And so these are some of the options for help if it's something that you are interested in. There are social skills groups that are focused on social thinking, parent coaching services, therapy, getting an evaluation at CHC. Medication options.
Something I sometimes try to talk with families about, like if I'm thinking about if a child's social anxiety or anxiety is so intense that would it be helpful to do a medication consultation? Because part of, if you're able to help reduce the intensity of anxiety, then hopefully the child is more available to start working on skills. Because if their anxiety is this high, it's going to be hard to be emotionally available to work on the things that they're feeling stressed about. So that's where talking with a child and adolescent psychiatrist could be helpful.
Sorry.
Well, I don't.
Yeah, I think that.
Are we wrapped up?
Yeah.
Okay.
You seem anxious about getting to the slide.
Yeah, I know. There's like, what's the balance of engagement and balance? Well, let me ask, she has a question back here. Yes.
Going back to one of the, like, general school strategy,
Uh-huh.
what do you mean adapt study skills as needed?
Adapt study skills as needed?
That's where it says, adapt study skills as needed.
Um,
It's number
second
2 on the.
Adapt study skills as needed. So I think my thought around that was probably as far as like if there's executive functioning support they need, or if it's also about adapting or homework modifications, that could be phrased better. But I think it's like if repetition isn't needed, then is there a way to reduce homework load so they don't have so much at night? So that's kind of, yeah.
And or it could be that when children are anxious, they can feel extremely overwhelmed and just not know where to start or have difficulties with things like procrastination. Like there's so much stuff I just don't even know where to begin. And so helping lay out a plan for, okay, let's start here, and kind of be their frontal lobe a little bit.
Yep.
And some schools have after school study skills.
Also true. Yeah.
Isn't therapy is, versus behaviorally, we should be more,
Appropriate?
yeah.
It depends on, so there's behavioral support, there's therapy support. So I think that's a good question, depending on what are the diagnostic stuff that a child comes with. Is there more beyond anxiety that a child has that might indicate one direction versus another? So, because, yeah. Not sure how to answer that question, but yeah. Any other questions?
I guess I just have one, like, how is it my son will say, like, he's able to verbalize, like, I don't know why I'm having these fears or these things seem very important to me. Is there a way to, like, kind of bring it to a 7-year-old version of, like, it's okay that you have these, this is kind of why? Because in his brain, he's like, I don't understand why I'm having kind of all these fears or anxieties about things. So is there, like, a very simple way to kind of explain, you know, there's a lot of people who have this, or these are okay, you know, and kind of, is there like a concise way to kind of say that? Yeah, like a correct language to say that?
Well, I think if you have, like,
I just ordered that, that's fine.
But sometimes that helps, but how do you make the language kid friendly?
Yeah.
And so what are some ways that you can talk about that, and that's where the externalizing, like sometimes people have these fears and worries where it's just like externalize it, so it's like thrown into tomato plant. And so sometimes something you might feel worried about, and then you continue to feel worried about it, and then all of a sudden that tomato plant is getting bigger and bigger, and then that thing is, you know, a really big deal. So I think that sometimes when you're reading books that help, how do you translate that into kid language? That can be helpful.
And I've used the worry bully a lot for younger kids.
Okay.
Look at this book. Yeah, and that book is it's referenced on our resources on the end of the site. Yeah. The what to do when.
So a what to do series. So there are also
You've written a lot of those.
What to do when you work.
The last one, Keep Your Dawn.
And it's like a workbook, right?
Yeah, so it has little pages, and you can so you can do the activity with your kid. If you feel
Which age for? And how young?
I think it's about 5 and up.
I think it's at 5 to 12.
Ages 6 to 12. Yeah, that means 5 years old, I'm sure. I think it's knowing your kid's developmental level. And yes.
I used to use a book with my daughter when she was young, and it's called Ready, Set, Relax. Do you know that book? And it's visualization, and it's just walking through, there's something here, so you're going to have a test, or she had separation anxiety, some different things, and you would go through these little scenarios and help them relax, and I like that book. I thought it was so cool. I don't remember who did, but it's Ready, Set, RELAX.
I forgot to mention, we have rating forms. If you're willing to do the survey tonight, that would be great. You can put it on the table over there. So thank you so much for that.